In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about making recommendations for a capital budget and also for capital budgeting projects specifically. So the basic idea behind the capital budget is that companies have a finite amount of money available to spend on capital budgeting kinds of projects. So when you're making recommendations to perhaps a manager or somebody in a decision-making capacity, the process might be a little bit different depending upon who's making the selections and who's not. So let's kind of talk through that a little bit. So one of the first things to kind of ask is if there's a corporate standard for payback, is that being met? So in other words, if the company has a standard that they have to get the money back within a certain length of time, is the project achieving that? So that's the first thing to check. Do we get the money back fast enough? And if there's some kind of a criterion for that at the company level, let's make sure we're getting the money back fast enough. Well, if we assume that the project is getting the money back fast enough, then the question becomes, all right, well, how do we look at these other things? Well, all right, let's calculate NPV, IRR, BCR. Okay, we should have already done that at this point. Let's rank the projects. Let's start looking at, which ones look better, which ones look worse, basically. Now, if you are making project selections, so if you are making the project selections, then basically what you're going to do is you're going to take the allotted budget that you have for these capital budgeting kind of projects, and you're going to try to maximize the total net present value. So that may mean that you wouldn't necessarily do the project with the highest net present value if that project means that you can't invest in others. So for instance, let's suppose you had $1 million to invest and you had three projects. One of them costs $600,000. The other one costs 500. Other two cost $500,000 each. Well, maybe that best project is the $600,000 project. But if I do that project and I've got my $1 million budget, I don't have enough money left over to do either of the other two. And so if I look at doing the other two combined might actually lead to a higher overall net present value than that one project by itself, leaving $400,000 uninvested. So that's kind of the idea. We want to look at the combination of net present value that we can get that gets the highest overall net present value given my budget, if I am the one that's making the decision. On the other hand, if I am not the one making the project selections, and I'm just making recommendations, then basically at that point, probably we'd want to put more weight on the profitability index when you make those recommendations. And the reason why is basically that profitability index is showing sort of your proverbial bang for your buck. In other words, kind of like how much increase in shareholder wealth, how much net present value do we get relative to the investment? Because I could have two investments that have the same net present value, but that have very different investment amounts. Let me give you an example. Let's suppose one project has a present value of expected future cash flows is $101 million. Initial cost is $100 million. So the net present value, $1 million. Let's look at a second project. Second project, the present value of expected future cash flows, $11 million. Initial cost, $10 million. Net present value, $1 million. So those two projects both have $1 million net present values. Clearly, project two, though, is a much better situation because I get that $1 million of net present value for a much smaller initial investment. So that would show up in that profitability index. That second project would have a much larger profitability index than that first project would. So if I'm not making project selections and I'm not trying to get everything to fit within a budget, basically using that profitability index probably makes a little bit more sense to say, hey, here's the group of projects that have sort of the best bang for our proverbial buck, right? The best amount of net present value given the investment. So that would be probably a better thing to do. Now, technically, it's really easy to calculate the MIRR. So it's super easy to do in Excel. But it's just kind of worth noting that, if that required rate of return and the IRR are super close together, I mean, there's just not much room in between for the MIRR because we know the MIRR is going to be in between. So, I mean, you can calculate it, but it doesn't really tell you a whole lot if the required rate of return and the IRR are really close. But if the IRR and the required rate of return are much further apart, then in that case, what you'd want to do is, let's look at that MIRR and maybe think about that a little bit more detail because that's going to give us a better assessment of what rate of return the project's really generating. And so there might be a little bit more value to looking at the MIRR if there's more of a gap between that required rate of return and the IRR. And so that might have a little bit more weight that you might want to present when making recommendations. All right, so hopefully this little video has been helpful. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.